their world. Okay. There we go. All right. Hello, New York, or whoever. Welcome to the first ever Quarantine Coffee Hour presented by the Erie Canal Museum in downtown Syracuse, New York. Can't visit at the moment because we're closed. But we're going to get to, have this nice chat here. Going to give people a little time to come on. Make sure everything's going well. So far, so good. If you could, say hello in the comments for us. I'm trying to see if these work. There we go. Okay. Hi, Lynn. How's it going? All right, good. Looks like we're up and running. So, again, welcome to Quarantine Coffee Hours. My name is Derek. I'm the educator at Erie Canal Museum. And thanks for joining us today on this lovely coffee hour. I've got with me my recess coffee mug. So remember to buy local, folks. Recess Coffee is a great local Syracuse, New York-based coffee brand. Drink coffee and shoot lightning. Sounds dangerous, but these are unprecedented times, so you do you. Now, time to talk about the Erie Canal, right? Okay. So I recognize that at the moment, a few of you watching are probably going to be new to the Erie Canal. So I'll just give you a little basic rundown of the canal before we get into the article. By the way, you can find a link to the article over here, I think, or it might be over here. I don't fully know. We're new to Facebook Live. Anyway, so the Erie Canal, what was it? Well, the Erie Canal was built in between 1817 and 1825 through the heart of New York State. So from what I just said there, you can tell we're celebrating the bicentennial of the canal at the moment. And this is an especially important year for Syracuse because it is the actual bicentennial of navigation on the canal through Syracuse, which is what we're going to talk a lot about today. Bigger things about the Erie Canal. PBS has called, they in 2017 had a documentary that's called The Erie Canal, the canal that changed America, and that's very accurate. The canal linked the east and west coasts for really the first time ever with an efficient transportation system. There's one estimate I've seen that said about 60% of the nation's trade at one point traveled on the Erie Canal. And I know we'll have some people from New York City tuning in. Shout out to all my friends in New York. New York became the nation's leading port following the completion of this 363-mile waterway. That's one of the big effects of it. Also, a bunch of cities sprang up around it, including Syracuse, New York, which will bring me to today's article. So the article, 1820, A Year to Celebrate, was written by me. Some of you might have already seen it in our newsletter earlier that was released earlier this year. You can get that newsletter if you become a member at the Erie Canal Museum. But anyway, the article looked at the first several months of of the canal's history in Syracuse in 1820. Um, well, let's delve into it. So Syracuse at the beginning of 1820 was pretty much a brand new thing. People, European American settlers, had been living there for a few decades at that point. Most of the population was concentrated either to the north in Salina or Salt Point, which was on the banks of Onondaga Lake, and others were in Onondaga Hollow up in the hills to the south. What would eventually become Syracuse was essentially a swampy crossroads between Salina Street and Genesee Street. Well, they were turnpikes at the time. But yeah, the first building there was Henry Bogardus's Tavern. That's why Syracuse, what eventually became Syracuse, was called Bogardus Corners at one point. It was called South Salina at other points. Also called Cossett's Corners, because a guy named Cossett bought Bogardus's Tavern. And later, some of the early settlers tried to name it Corinth and Milan. And when they applied to get post offices named that, sadly for them, both of those town names were already taken in the state of New York. So those were out. So that brings us to 1820, early in the year. Early settler named John Wilkinson. He had read a poem about Syracuse, Italy, in Sicily. And he thought there were a lot of similarities. There's even a town called Salina near Syracuse, and they make salt there. So they started calling it Syracuse. The rest, as they say, is history. I gotta say, the Syracuse orange sounds a lot better than the Cossett's Corners orange. So glad they got Syracuse in the end. But 1820, Syracuse was kind of this idea more than an actual thing. Syracuse isn't going to be incorporated as a village until 1825. They fully complete the canal, but 1820 is really, I would say, the beginning of Syracuse. Gets its name, and it also gets the waterway that built it, the Erie Canal. Somehow I can't see if people are commenting here. Either that or people aren't commenting. I don't know. Vicky, I know you're watching, so if you could, I don't know. Never mind. Anywho, so into the story. Okay, so they started digging the Erie Canal in Rome, New York in July 4th, 1817. And they did that for a very important reason. Rome is on what's known as the long level of the canal, which is 68 miles that do not require a lock. Which is very important because in 1817, there were no trained engineers in the United States. So they were kind of just making it up as they went along a little bit. So they went with the easiest section first. The canal was controversial when they were first building it, so politicians in their brilliance were like, let's build the easy part first, get that done, show the residents of New York, hey, look, a canal is possible. And that 68-mile stretch is between Utica and Syracuse, pretty much, before you need to get a lock. So they were able to make tons of progress on that section, and a little bit further, all the way west to the Seneca River. That's called the middle division of the canal. So there you have it. They start building it, make a lot of progress, and by 1819, they can actually have the first ever voyage on the Erie Canal. That takes place between Rome and Utica and back on October 23rd, 1819. The canal really wasn't complete at that point, but it was complete enough that you could put some water into it, and a boat could travel up and down it, and the politicians could, be like, hey, look, we're doing some great stuff here, which they were. The boat that does that run is called the Chief Engineer of Rome. It's named after the chief engineer of the whole project, Benjamin Wright, who lived in Rome. He is often called the father of American civil engineering. The boat is designed by really this prodigy, also from the Rome area, Canvas White. He's a young man in his 20s, brilliant. Benjamin Wright recognizes his potential. Canvas White is from Whitesboro. He's actually descended from Hugh White. So, yeah, the guy who founds Whitesboro. So, kind of a big deal in Whitesboro. And also shout out to Phil Keys. I know he asked about us doing stuff on Canvas White, so here I am talking about Canvas White a little. Canvas White is going to do a lot of other important things in the history of the canal, but for right now, we're going to talk about him and the first boat on the Erie Canal, the chief engineer of Rome. So Canvas White, he's recognized for being brilliant, and Benjamin Wright sends him to England in 1817 to study all of the British canals. Which Canvas White does very well. He travels on thousands of miles of canals in England, which already has a very extensive canal network, checks those out, and reports back to Benjamin Wright what he's found out in 1819. And they find out they're going to be able to put a boat on it. So Canvas White gives them plans for a boat based largely on British canal boats. And hey, there we go. We got another comment. Hi, Vanessa. So he takes his British canal boat scheme, builds it. It's kind of a rough boat, but it does the trick. And it takes the canal commissioners and everything from Rome to Utica and back. There's a big celebration. Actually, the last year, the New York State Canal Corporation recreated this voyage, in fact, in October. But that's the first voyage. It's a rough one. There's not enough water in the canal. And, hello, Connor. There's not enough water in the canal at the time. And at one point, I believe a dam may have burst. They might have run out of water in the canal, so they had to drag it through the mud. It's a rough voyage. So over the winter, they keep working on the canal. And by spring of 1820, that canal boat, the canal is ready to have people on it. And it is possible. I'd like to recognize the work of canal historian Richard Palmer right now, who scours over microfilm a lot of old newspapers and stuff. He believes he's found accounts of some boats traveling before the Montezuma, which is what we're really going to focus on here, traveling up and down. But this is the early days of the canal where since central New York was landlocked, people didn't have boats. They were just putting whatever they could really get to float into the canal. The classic canal boat doesn't fully exist yet. Hi, Natalie. So, what was I saying? There may have been a few boats that traveled on the Erie Canal before the boat we're going to focus on today traveled. This boat, the Montezuma, though, will be the first packet boat for sure to ever enter Syracuse, New York. Packet boat's a very special type of boat. They're the iconic boat of the Erie Canal, you might say. They carried passengers. They're different from a freight boat, which carried freight, or a line boat, which you can see at the Erie Canal Museum when we open up again, or on a virtual tour that you can find on our website, eriecanalmuseum.org. A line boat carried both passengers and cargo. But packet boats, they're important boats. They're famous on the canal. And the first one we're really going to get in depth into is the Montezuma, which was built in the winter of 1820, the early winter of 1820, in Montezuma, New York, a small town out by the Seneca River, which was really the end point of the middle section of the canal. The middle section is going to run between the Seneca River and and Utica and the Mohawk River. So Montezuma is 70 feet long, 12 feet wide, I believe. I don't have the article up in front of me, and I did not put it in my notes. But historian Gerard Copel, in his book, Bond of Union, which is a great book, highly suggest it, about the Erie Canal, describes the Montezuma as being 20 years ahead of its time in terms of design and the luxury that was on it. It has 2 cabins, one with a kitchen, one for passengers. And as we're going to see, it can carry a lot of people, comfortably, probably 100, but on this voyage we're going to talk about, it will get up to 150 people will be on the boat. And the other interesting thing about the Montezuma is the guy who built it, who I find incredibly fascinating. Comfort Tyler. Lovely name, Comfort. But Comfort Tyler is a fascinating character in the history of central New York and Syracuse, particularly. He was born in Connecticut, but signed up to fight in the Revolutionary War. Spent most of his time at West Point, I believe. It's after that he gets his Revolutionary War claim, like so many people from Connecticut and New England end up doing. And that claim is in upstate New York. Heads out there. He actually marries General Herkimer's half-sister. So he ends up being well connected. He's good friends with these other early settlers out here, the Danforths, which they're very famous as some of the earliest settlers of the Syracuse area. Travels out with the Danforths to Onondaga Lake, and Comfort Tyler is credited with helping to boil the first kettle of salt at Salt Point, which is a pretty big deal. Salt in the Erie Canal are what built Syracuse. And really, salt helped build the Erie Canal. One estimate has it that 1/3 of the canal was paid for using taxes on Syracuse-made salt. So, salt, big deal. And Comfort Tyler is right there making some of the first salt. So in addition to making salt, Comfort Tyler was everywhere. He gets elected to the New York State Assembly twice. He's the sheriff. He's the coroner. He's the first ever postmaster for Onondaga County. He's also county clerk. He's the justice of the peace for Manlius. He's a pretty big deal. Okay, he also keeps the tavern in Onondaga Hollow, which is probably why everybody liked him a lot. But it is actually when he's in the state assembly that one of the most interesting parts about Comfort Tyler happens. It's there that he meets a fella that you might be familiar with, former Vice President of the United States, also the only vice president that I know of, charged with murder during his vice presidential tenure, Aaron Burr, proud son of New York. Comfort Tyler meets Aaron Burr in the legislature, and after Aaron Burr stopped being vice president, he and Thomas Jefferson don't particularly like each other, plus the whole killing an American hero thing also doesn't look too good, so he's not vice president for Jefferson's second term. Anywho, Aaron Burr heads out to an island in the Ohio River on December 6th. Comfort Tyler follows him with 4 boats laden with supplies. They're just having a great time out in the Ohio River, probably, barbecuing. It's early in the year, ice skating, who knows, until the federal government arrests them for treason. That would be because it's up for debate what was fully happening here, but it's believed that Burr was planning on leading a group of armed men down the Mississippi River, probably to conquer New Orleans, and then to either establish a new country in what was then Mexican Texas, or try to break off the eastern part of the United States. They don't really get anywhere on that, but Comfort Tyler is one of the people who is indicted in that plot. He's never brought up on the treason charges, but Aaron Burr does actually have to go to court about this. He's acquitted eventually because there's not really a lot of evidence. It's a whole thing, not in the context of this. But Comfort Tyler, people aren't big fans of his treason, possibly. So that kind of ruins his life in Syracuse, in the Syracuse area. He had been running for Congress and stuff before this point. That's not happening anymore. And he kind of leaves Onondaga County in shame, moves to Montezuma, where he's a real go-getter, so he's still doing well out in Montezuma. And when he is a big proponent of the Erie Canal. He fights for the canal, realizes it's going to really help out central New York. And when they start building the canal, he's right on top of it. He builds this great boat, the Montezuma. So now we're finally to the heart of our story, the voyages of the Montezuma. Montezuma is completed April 13th. They launch it in Montezuma, take it through the Montezuma locks down to the Seneca River with a few people from Montezuma on it, and then back up through the locks, and they dock it, and it sits there for a week. Then, on April 20th, 1820, is the big day. They're going to take the boat into Syracuse. But was it April 20th? That's a bit of a controversy. See, when I first started researching this, lots of sources say April 21st and others say April 20th. And it's very confusing. So I did some looking into it. And I think I've come to what I think is a pretty decent conclusion. Feel free to disagree with me, though. That April 20th is the date the Montezuma entered Syracuse. And I believe I discovered the source of the confusion. In 1848, a guy named Joshua Victor Hopkins Clark writes a book called Onondaga, or Reminiscences of Earlier and Later Times. Very succinct title, but it is available on Google Books. I would highly suggest it if you want to learn more about Onondaga County. Some of the historic facts aren't always accurate, but beside the point, like we're talking about here, it seems like he may have been the person who misidentified this date, and tons of people use him as a source going forward in history, notably Franklin Chase in his Syracuse and Its Environs from 1923, an epic on the city of Syracuse, which also identifies April 21st as when the Montezuma comes through. However, The reason I think it's April 20th, and it appears most other contemporary canal historians like Jared Kopel, Dr. Robert Hager, they identify April 20th as the date because on April 25th, 1820, the Onondaga Register writes up a whole report on this event. And in that report, it says right at the start, on Thursday last, quote, on Thursday last, arrived at Syracuse, parentheses, Salina, from Montezuma, the elegant canal barge Montezuma, end quote. So that right there says it all. On Thursday last. The Thursday before that issue came out was April 20th. And they're much closer to the source than Clark was, and he probably didn't have access, honestly, to that copy. He was doing the best he could, I'm sure. But now modern historianship, I think, has proven that it's April 20th. The Onondaga Register seems like it would be telling the truth, right? Anywho, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's get to the voyage. Montezuma sets out from Montezuma, headed towards Syracuse, and everybody crowds the banks. They want to see this great triumph over nature. The way people seem to describe it a lot in the 1800s is water moving uphill, even though that's not exactly how a canal works. Water's pretty much flat. It's just move boats down it. But they were all like, wow, a boat's going to enter Syracuse. What? So they're waiting for it, and then they keep waiting. The boat's supposed to arrive at noon, but it does not arrive at that time, much to the consternation of Syracusians. They start, it's just like when Syracuse loses one game in basketball. Today, everyone's like, throw out the whole canal. It's never going to be any good. Why don't we toss Clinton and the rest of the people who designed it to the bottom of the canal? They think that this experiment has not worked. They believe the Montezuma sank, and you shouldn't be messing with nature and trying to move boats uphill. Well, as it turns out, they were actually just hooking up some new horses in Jordan, New York, which is a few miles to the west of Syracuse. Presumably, so the Montezuma could enter in a nice, majestic, and regal fashion. Anne Royer asked the question earlier this week about those horses. I just wanted to know if we know anything more about the horses. Unfortunately, we do not know what breed of horse they were or anything. I know that in the Onondaga Register article, it does say that they would have only needed one horse to really do the job, but they added two for some nice effect and, ease the burden on all the horses. But I could answer the second part of her question, which was if mules were prevalent on the canal yet, because we all know the song, I Got a Mule and Her Name is Sail, 15 miles in the Erie Canal. The mule is the ubiquitous animal of the Erie Canal, right? Well, mules were not frequently used on the canal at this point. Much like the how I described the early boats of the canal, where they're just throwing anything in that would float. They were hooking anything up to a boat that could pull it. I believe the chief engineer of Rome on that initial voyage was pulled by oxen, which really added to the slowness of it. But really, mules aren't going to be used until much later in the Erie Canal. There is an often told story that mules started being used on the Erie Canal around the Civil War when New York soldiers see that they use mules a lot down south, and that the Army uses mules a lot. So if a mule can pull a cannon well, it can pull a boat well. Though I believe there is scholarship now that is kind of refuting this story a bit. However, that said, the Montezuma was a packet boat, so it would have definitely been pulled by horses all the time. Packet boats were almost exclusively pulled by horses. The packet boat was the fancy boat of the Erie Canal, and horses were considered the premier animal to pull them. So all canal boats, or all packet boats, were pulled by horses. You ever go back in time and you see a canal boat being pulled by something that's not a horse, don't get on it. That captain's probably a dishonest hooligan. So it doesn't run a good ship. So horses pulled packet boats for the whole history of the canal, though really packet boats stopped being popular around the 1850s when railroads could do their job a lot better. Anywho, with those new horses attached to the Montezuma comes speeding into Syracuse. It probably was not following the 4-mile-an-hour speed limit that was supposed to keep wakes down, because in the Onondaga Register report, it says that the crowds had their feet soaked by the waves that were kicked up by the Montezuma as it entered Syracuse, which quieted down all the people who were saying this canal's not going to work. But it also led the people of Syracuse to erupt in cheers and all that. And for the next two hours in Syracuse, they have a big old party. And everybody's going onto the boat, checking it out, saying like, yes, gangplanks, neat. It's a boat with windows. It floats. Cool things like that, They're celebrating it, checking it out. But then it's time for the main show. Because remember, Syracuse is not a particularly notable settlement at the time. The big settlement is to the north in Salina, which Salina does not fall on the route of the Erie Canal. No, it's a bit to the north of the canal, about 1.5 miles away. But that's where all the salt is being produced. So the state of New York recognized they needed to get that salt. And as a result, they had authorized the building of a side canal. Now, as the history of the Erie Canal goes on, there's going to be tons of side canals. My hometown, Chittenango, New York, had one, which served as both a feeder and a channel for commerce to get into downtown Syracuse. Chittenango. The Salina Cut is not a feeder canal like a lot of other side canals, but it is there, so you can easily get to the salt up in Salina. And it's the first canal that the state of New York ever commissions. The Chittenango one is actually the second commissioned canal. But that's just me sharing some history about Chittenango. Anywho, they go up the Salina Canal. Now, the Salina Canal is actually at the juncture of what was then the Salina Canal and the Erie Canal, is right where the Erie Canal Museum is located, the intersection of Oswego and Erie Boulevard, which both of those roads are built on the foundation of canals. Oswego Boulevard, which is where the Salina Canal would have been, eventually the Salina Canal is extended all the way up to Lake Ontario. So Ontario is connected into the whole canal system and becomes the Oswego Canal. But anyway, that's jumping way ahead of ourselves. This is 1820. The boat goes to right in front of where the Erie Canal Museum is now, turns up. the Salina side cut, with about 100 people on it, and the rest of Syracuse follows along on the towpath. And from the Onondaga Register article, it seems like a lot of them were jumping onto the boat as well, because the article mentions that they set out with 100 people, ended up with many more by the time they reach Salina 22 minutes later. Not blazing fast speed to go 1.5 miles, but pretty fast for the 1800s. So they arrive in Salina. That's where the big party is. There's a band awaiting them. It's the Salina Band, and it leads a procession from the boat to Beach's Tavern, where they no doubt have a lovely celebration. I'd like to point out now that in addition to salt, one of the great exports of the West at that time was whiskey, so take that as you will. And after a few hours of enjoying their time at Salina, they head back down the Salina Canal with 150 people on them, back to Syracuse. And we don't really know what happens to the Montezuma immediately after that. But we do know what happens to the Montezuma generally. So that's owned by Comfort Tyler, and Comfort Tyler has seen how great these packet boats are, so he actually bought the the chief engineer, which we discussed earlier, out in Utica. And that boat enters Syracuse 3 days later, on April 23rd, probably also to a bunch of fanfare, no doubt. What else you got to do in 1820s Syracuse? And Comfort Tyler plans on running a regular packet line using these two boats between Syracuse and Utica. The Seneca River and Utica, which is 94 miles. He plans on starting that May 1st, 1820. Few little side notes. The Onondaga Register article says that the water in the canal at that point was 2.5 feet deep. The canal is designed to be 4 feet deep. No doubt they were having a hard time getting water into the canal at this point. But luckily, the canal boat still only had a 1-foot draft. So that was pretty good. They were not scraping the bottom of the canal, and there was still plenty of room under it for hydraulic drag, so they could have moved fast enough. That's a whole physics thing, and I'm a history major. I don't really understand that stuff fully. So, that's a little more about the Erie Canal. Are there any questions? Please comment on this video. If people have been commenting, I somehow can't see them. So I apologize if you've asked more questions. I will try to answer them more in the comment section. I will also include a link to that book by Joshua Victor Hopkins Clark, in the comments. And I would also just like to add that we thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this talk. And we're trying our best to keep you guys entertained during this whole COVID-19 situation. Be sure to follow the Erie Canal Museum. We're posting new things pretty much every day. And also, a side note, we do expect to lose quite a bit of revenue during this time. A lot of people focus on the small businesses of the community, which do need your help, as do our not-for-profits. So if you could donate however much you feel like you can to the Erie Canal Museum. You can use eriecanalmuseum.org/support. I know the link is in the description of this video. So thank you very much. Since I'm not seeing any questions here, adios, and I'll see you next week. We're going to be talking about kids on the canal and an article written by our curator, Ashley Moretti. So, see ya. Stay safe.